My name is Serafina Reyes, and for the first 27 years of my life, my story was a quiet one, written in the margins of other people's grander narratives. I grew up in the misty, rain-washed suburbs of Port Blossom, a city that prizes old money and quiet prestige. My world was one of second-hand books, mended clothes, and the rich, earthy smell of the community garden where my mother taught me that patience and care could coax life from the most stubborn soil. I was a studious, observant child who preferred the company of stories to the clatter of playgrounds. My brother, Dominic, 2 years my senior, was the opposite. He was born for the sun, all bright smiles and easy confidence, the kind of person who never had to ask for a place at the table because one was always set for him. Our parents, good and loving people, did their best. My father was a high school history teacher, my mother a librarian. They gave us a home filled with warmth and knowledge, but not with the kind of financial cushion that allows for missteps. Dominic, with his natural charm, glided into a business degree and then into a junior position at Dalton and Sons, a venerable Port Blossom investment firm. He met Isabel there. She was the daughter of a partner, a woman sculpted from marble and ambition, whose laughter sounded like the clinking of expensive glassware. She was everything I was not, polished, assertive, and seamlessly at ease in a world that had always felt just beyond my reach. My own path had been less direct. I fell in love too young with a poet who had beautiful words and empty pockets. We had our son, Milo, a burst of sunlight in our small, rented apartment. But love, I learned, wasn't enough to pay the bills or soothe the restless spirit of a man who felt the world owed him a masterpiece. When Milo was 2, his father left to find himself in a different time zone, leaving behind a stack of overdue notices and a hole in our lives. For the next 3 years, I was a single mother. That title, so often spoken with either pity or disdain, became the spine of my existence. It meant working 2 jobs, a morning shift at a quiet bookstore and an evening one waiting tables at a bistro downtown. It meant rocking a feverish child at 3 a.m. with the cold dread of a dwindling sick day allowance in the pit of my stomach. It meant celebrating birthdays with a homemade cake and one carefully chosen gift. It was a life of quiet desperation and fierce, boundless love. Dominic and Isabel would sometimes invite me to family functions, their pity a palpable thing in the air, a thick, uncomfortable cloak they draped over me. I was their project, their reminder of how fortunate they were. Then, on a rainy Tuesday evening at the bistro, Adrian walked in. He wasn't looking for a distraction. He was just looking for a quiet meal after a long day. He sat at one of my tables, his presence a calm island in the bustling room. He had kind eyes, a way of listening that made you feel seen, and he didn't once look at me with the polite condescension I had grown so used to. We talked between my rounds to other tables, about books and old buildings and the way the rain in Port Blossom could feel like a cleansing. He was a principal at a private equity firm, a world away from mine, but he spoke of his work with a passion for building, for creating something lasting. He saw the ink stains on my fingers and asked what I was reading. He saw the fatigue in my eyes and asked about my day, and he truly listened to the answer. Our courtship was slow and gentle, a stark contrast to the whirlwind romance of my youth. With Adrian, I felt not swept away, but safely anchored. He loved Milo without reservation, meeting him not as a burden, but as the bright, wonderful center of my world. When he asked me to marry him a year later, on a windswept beach with Milo chasing seagulls nearby, it wasn't because he wanted to save me. It was, he said, because he had finally found a partner whose strength humbled him. My family was relieved. Dominic clapped him on the back, impressed by his success. Isabel, however, saw my new life as a transaction. In her eyes, I hadn't earned it. I had simply lucked into it. I had traded in my waitress's apron for a life of comfort, and she would never let me forget that I was, at my core, an imposter in her world. It's simply a different kind of achievement, isn't it? Isabel's voice, melodic and sharp, drifted across the manicured lawn of their waterfront home. When it's handed to you on a silver platter. My hand, holding a glass of iced tea, faltered for a second. I was sitting on a cushioned wicker chair, trying to make myself small at the annual garden party she and Dominic hosted every summer. The air was thick with the scent of roses and salt from the Sound, a picture-perfect afternoon. Milo was with Adrian's parents for the weekend, a rare treat that I had been looking forward to. Now, I wished I could be with him, building a lopsided sandcastle, far from this polite, smiling battlefield. Isabel was speaking to a small group of women, wives of Dominic's colleagues. Her back was mostly to me, a calculated gesture that made her words feel both private and intentionally public. She laughed, a light, tinkling sound. I mean, I admire the hustle, of course. But some of us build our lives, brick by brick. We get the degrees, we climb the ladder. Others just find a faster elevator. One of the women, a blonde in a linen dress, glanced nervously in my direction. I kept my gaze fixed on the shimmering water, pretending I hadn't heard. But the words had landed, small, sharp darts in the softest part of my heart. It wasn't the accusation of being a gold digger that stung the most, it was the complete erasure of the years that came before. The years of scrubbing floors, of counting change for bus fare, of whispering "we'll be okay" into my son's hair when I wasn't sure it was true. In her narrative, my struggle was invisible, my resilience meaningless. I was just a before and after picture, and she was dismissing the before as irrelevant. Dominic, standing nearby, overheard. He offered a tight, complicit smile, a silent endorsement of his wife's commentary. In that moment, the familiar ache of being an outsider in my own family settled deep in my bones. It wasn't a fiery anger, but a profound and weary sadness. I had spent so long trying to earn their approval, to prove that I was more than my circumstances, and yet, here I was, still being defined by them. Quietly, I stood up. The movement was small, but it drew a few glances. My heart was pounding, a frantic bird against my ribs. I wanted to say something, to defend the woman I had been, the woman who had fought so hard to keep her and her son's heads above water. But I knew it would be pointless. My story, in their eyes, was already written. Arguing would only make me look defensive, emotional, uncouth. So, I did the only thing I could. I set down my glass, picked up my small handbag, and began to walk toward the gate, my footsteps silent on the soft grass. It was not a retreat, it was an act of self-preservation. I was drawing a boundary, a quiet line in the sand that said, "You do not get to do this to me anymore." Serafina? Leaving so soon? Isabel's voice called after me, laced with a saccharine sweetness that was more insulting than her earlier cruelty. I didn't turn around. "I'm not feeling well," I said, the words barely a whisper. It wasn't a lie. My soul felt bruised. As I reached the ornate iron gate at the end of their driveway, a familiar graphite gray sedan pulled up to the curb. Adrian stepped out. He must have finished his Saturday work calls early. He took one look at my face, and the warm smile he'd been wearing vanished, replaced by a quiet, immediate concern. "Serafina? What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low. Tears I hadn't even realized were forming pricked at the corners of my eyes. "I just want to go home," I whispered. He didn't press for details. He simply wrapped an arm around my shoulders, his presence a solid, comforting weight. He guided me to the passenger side of the car, opened the door, and made sure I was settled before closing it gently behind me. He walked around to the driver's side, but before getting in, he looked back at the party. Dominic and Isabel were watching from the porch, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Adrian's gaze met theirs across the lawn. He didn't shout, he didn't make a scene. He just held their stare for a long, silent moment. His disappointment was a palpable force, more powerful than any angry words could ever be. Then he got into the car and drove us away, leaving them standing in the gilded cage of their perfect afternoon. The car was quiet as we drove along the winding coastal road. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with unspoken understanding. Adrian reached over and took my hand, his thumb stroking the back of it gently. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," he said. "But I'm here." And so, I told him. The words tumbled out, not in a rush of anger, but in a stream of quiet pain. I told him about the casual cruelty, the dismissal, the feeling of being a ghost at my own family's table. "It's not that they think I married you for money," I explained, my voice thick with emotion. It's that they think that's all I am. That the person I was before, the mother I was to Milo, the fight in me, that it all counts for nothing. Like I was just waiting to be rescued. He listened, his eyes on the road, his grip on my hand firm and steady. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. "They're wrong," he said finally, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "They're wrong because they measure worth in dollar signs and job titles. They look at you and see a reflection of my success because they're too blind to see the strength that was in you all along. Serafina, I didn't fall in love with a woman who needed rescuing. I fell in love with a woman who had already saved herself, time and time again." His words were a balm on a raw wound. But I knew deep down that his belief in me, while a precious gift, wasn't enough. I needed to believe it myself. I needed to build something that was so undeniably mine that no one, not even Isabel, could attribute it to luck or charity. That evening, as the rain began to fall, pattering softly against the windows of our home, an idea began to form. It was an idea that had been dormant for years, a quiet dream I'd had back when I spent my evenings shelving books about local history and architecture. I had always been drawn to the city's forgotten buildings, the old waterfront cannery with its broken windows, the abandoned textile mill by the river, the grand, derelict public library downtown. People saw urban decay. I saw stories, character, and potential. I turned to Adrian, the half-formed thought suddenly feeling urgent and real. "I want to do something," I said. "Something for me. Something that I can build." He turned to face me fully, his expression open and encouraging. "Okay," he said simply. "What do you have in mind?" "The old buildings," I said, the words gaining momentum. "The ones everyone has given up on. I want to bring them back to life. Not just flip them, but restore them. Turn them into something the community can use. Artist studios, workshops, affordable housing, a real library." A slow smile spread across Adrian's face. It wasn't the indulgent smile of a husband humoring his wife's new hobby. It was a smile of genuine respect. "That's a brilliant idea," he said. "But it's not easy. It's a tough business. Zoning, financing, construction." "I know," I said, my voice firm. "But you know that world. You could teach me. Not do it for me. Teach me. I want to learn how to read the financials, how to negotiate with contractors, how to structure a deal. I want to understand every single brick." He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw in his eyes the same thing he must have seen in mine a year ago at the bistro, a flicker of fierce, unyielding determination. "All right, Serafina Reyes," he said softly. "Let's get you a set of blueprints." That night, something shifted within me. The sadness from Isabel's garden party didn't disappear, but it transmuted into fuel. It was no longer about proving her wrong, it was about proving me right. I wasn't a supporting character in anyone's story anymore. I was about to start writing my own. The next 2 years were my secret apprenticeship. While the world saw me as Adrian's wife, a woman who attended charity galas and parent-teacher conferences, I was living a double life. My days were a carefully constructed mosaic of motherhood and education. I'd drop Milo off at school, then head not to a yoga class or a leisurely lunch, but to a small, sunlit office I'd set up in a spare room of our house. The walls were soon covered in city maps, architectural sketches, and flowcharts explaining the labyrinthine world of commercial real estate finance. Adrian was a patient and demanding teacher. He didn't give me answers. He gave me books, case studies, and problems to solve. He'd come home from his own demanding job, and we'd sit at the dining room table long after Milo was asleep, poring over spreadsheets. He taught me the language of capital, of risk, of leverage, and equity. My old bookstore discount came in handy as I ordered texts on urban planning, contract law, and historical preservation. I discovered I had a mind for it, a knack for seeing the hidden value, the potential in a crumbling facade that others had written off. The same observational skills that had made me a quiet child now made me a shrewd analyst. I named my nascent company Havenwood Ventures. The name felt right. I wanted to create havens, both literally in the buildings I restored and figuratively, for the people who would use them. My first project was a modest one, a small, derelict, clapboard building in the old cannery district that had once been a Harborage master's office. It was slated for demolition. The city sold it to me for a pittance, $1 on the condition that I restore it to historical code. It was a gamble. The foundation was shaky, the roof leaked, and the plumbing was a relic from a bygone era. I was there every day in steel-toed boots and a hard hat, my hair tied back in a messy bun. I learned to talk to contractors, to distinguish between a load-bearing wall and a partition, to argue over the price of reclaimed timber. There were moments of overwhelming doubt. One rainy afternoon, standing in the gutted shell of the building with a revised budget that was bleeding red ink, I nearly gave up. I called Adrian, my voice trembling. "I can't do this," I said. I was crazy to think I could. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice a calm anchor in my storm of panic. "Remember what you told me about that retaining wall? Call the structural engineer. Ask him about micropiles. You know the solution, Serafina. You just need to trust yourself to see it." He was right. I hung up, took a deep breath, and made the call. It was a turning point. I stopped seeing myself as a student playing at business and started seeing myself as the person in charge. 6 months later, the Harborage master's office reopened as the anchor. It housed a small, independent coffee shop on the ground floor and 2 beautiful, light-filled writing studios upstairs, which I rented out at an affordable rate to local authors. It wasn't a massive financial success, but it was a victory. It was a tangible piece of the world that I had built with my own hands, my own mind. It was my first brick. After the anchor, the projects grew in scale. I acquired a forgotten textile mill and, over a challenging but exhilarating year, transformed it into Millrace Commons, a vibrant hub with artisan workshops, a daycare, and a community event space. I hired a small, dedicated team, a sharp project manager who'd been laid off from a larger firm, a young architect with a passion for sustainable design, and a bookkeeper who had been struggling to re-enter the workforce after raising her children. I didn't care about prestigious pedigrees. I cared about passion and grit. Havenwood Ventures started to get noticed. A few articles appeared in the Port Blossom Business Journal, praising the anonymous firm for its thoughtful urban renewal projects. I deliberately kept my name out of it. I wasn't ready for the spotlight. My work was my focus, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing a neighborhood slowly come back to life was reward enough. Dominic and Isabel knew I was dabbling in some projects, as they put it. They saw it as a quaint hobby, a rich wife's pastime. Isabel once asked me at a family dinner if I was enjoying my little decorating venture. I just smiled and said it was very fulfilling, letting her condescension wash over me. It didn't sting anymore. I was too busy building my world to worry about her perception of it. Then, one crisp autumn evening, Adrian came home with a troubled look on his face. He loosened his tie and sat down heavily on the sofa. "I heard something today," he said, his voice low. "Through the grapevine. It's about Dalton and Sons." I paused, a file folder open on my lap. Dalton and Sons. Dominic's firm. The institution that represented everything my brother aspired to be. "What about them?" I asked. "They're in trouble," Adrian said. "Serious trouble. Over-leveraged on a massive new development downtown that just lost its primary tenant. They've been trying to keep it quiet, but the banks are getting nervous. They're quietly looking for a buyout, a lifeline before it all goes public." I sat there, processing the information. There was no flicker of triumph, no surge of schadenfreude. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow ache. Dominic had hitched his entire identity to that company, to its air of invincible, old-world prestige. He'd built his life on what he thought was solid granite, but it had turned out to be sand. The same sand he and Isabel had accused me of building on. "The board is trying to find a private buyer," Adrian continued, watching me carefully. "Someone who can acquire the debt and restructure the portfolio without a public fire sale that would destroy the firm's reputation." He paused. "Their portfolio includes several historically significant properties in the city center. Properties they've neglected for years, including the old Grand Majestic Theater." My breath caught. The Grand Majestic. It was a crumbling Art Deco masterpiece that had been shuttered since I was a child. I used to press my face against its dusty glass doors, imagining the ghosts of audiences past. It was the crown jewel of forgotten Port Blossom, and I had dreamed of restoring it for years. I looked at Adrian, and he saw the idea ignite in my eyes before I even spoke a word. "It's a huge risk, Serafina," he said softly. "Their books are a mess. It would be the biggest, most complicated thing you've ever done." "I know," I said, my heart starting to pound with a mixture of terror and exhilarating purpose. "But those buildings, that theater, someone needs to save them." It was no longer just about me. It was about the city I loved. And it was about proving that a foundation built on care, on restoration, on seeing the value in what is broken, was stronger than one built on arrogance and blind ambition. "Get me everything you can on Dalton and Sons," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I want to see the books." The file on Dalton and Sons was thicker than a novel and far more tragic. For weeks, my small team and I worked in quiet, intense sessions, dissecting the firm's finances. It was a story of hubris and neglect. Dominic's father-in-law had retired, leaving a leadership vacuum filled by men who were skilled at wining and dining clients, but lacked the foresight for a changing market. They had made reckless bets, ignored shifting economic tides, and bled the company's foundational assets dry to fund flashy, high-risk ventures. Dominic, caught up in the culture of aggressive growth, had clearly been complicit, signing off on deals he likely didn't fully understand. The irony was painful. The very institution that prided itself on legacy and stability had gambled it all away. Making the offer was the most terrifying thing I had ever done. It wasn't a hostile takeover, it was a rescue mission, structured as a private acquisition by an unnamed holding company, a shell I created to keep Havenwoods and my identity confidential for the time being. We offered to absorb the toxic debt and inject fresh capital in exchange for a controlling interest. For the board of Dalton and Sons, it was a lifeline they couldn't refuse. It allowed them to save face, to avoid public disgrace. They accepted the offer within a week. They had no idea who was on the other side of the table. The day the deal closed, I felt a profound sense of gravity, not victory. I now held the future of my brother's career and the legacy of the company he so admired in my hands. That evening, I walked with Milo by the waterfront, the cool evening air clearing my head. He held my hand, chattering about a book he was reading, his small, warm presence a constant reminder of what truly mattered. This wasn't a game. It was about building a better, more stable future for my company, for the city, and maybe, just maybe, for my family, too. I scheduled the meeting for the following Tuesday. I chose the location carefully, the large conference room at Millrace Commons, my restored textile mill. The room overlooked the river, its walls a mix of exposed original brick and sleek, modern glass. It was a space that spoke of my philosophy, honoring the past while building for the future. My note to Dominic was simple and professional, sent through official channels. It requested the presence of the senior management team for an introductory meeting with the new ownership. I'm sure he assumed he would be meeting some faceless conglomerate from out of state. I was in the conference room early, standing by the window, watching the river flow. My team was with me, a quiet, supportive phalanx. I was dressed in a simple, well-tailored navy blue dress. I wore no jewelry except my wedding band. I wanted nothing to distract from the matter at hand. I felt calm-centered. The nervous girl from the garden party was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own worth, a worth measured not in dollars, but in every restored brick, every saved job, every dream she had painstakingly brought to life. At 10 o'clock sharp, the door opened. Dominic walked in, flanked by two older vice presidents. He looked tired, the strain of the past few weeks etched on his face, but he was trying to project an air of authority, his suit immaculate, his jaw set. He scanned the room, his eyes passing over me without recognition for a brief second before they snapped back. His face went slack with disbelief. The professional smile he had prepared froze, then crumbled. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if seeing a ghost. The two men with him looked from him to me, their confusion palpable. "Serafina," Dominic whispered, the name a puff of air. What are you doing here?" I stepped away from the window and walked to the head of the long oak table. I placed my hands on the back of the chair, the wood smooth and solid beneath my palms. "Good morning, Dominic." "Gentlemen," I said, my voice even and clear, resonating with the quiet authority that I had earned in countless negotiations and boardrooms. "Please have a seat. I believe we have a great deal to discuss." I met my brother's stunned, uncomprehending gaze. "I'm the managing partner of the firm that just acquired Dalton and Sons," I said, letting the words settle in the silent room. "Welcome to Havenwood Ventures." The silence that followed was absolute. The two vice presidents sank into their chairs, their faces a mask of shock. Dominic remained standing, rooted to the spot, his entire worldview tilting on its axis. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. "You," he finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse croak. "But how?" "I learned," I said simply. "While you were climbing the ladder at Dalton, I was learning how to build the ladder itself. This isn't a hobby, Dominic. This is my work." I gestured to the chair opposite me. "Please, sit down." He stumbled into the seat, his movements clumsy. He looked utterly lost. The confident, charming brother I had known my whole life had vanished, replaced by a man staring at the wreckage of his own assumptions. I didn't gloat. There was no triumph in seeing him so broken. I laid out my plan, not as a conqueror, but as a leader. I spoke of restructuring, of new strategies, of a return to core values. I spoke of my vision to restore the firm's neglected historical properties, starting with the grand, majestic theater. My team presented the data, the projections, the clear, logical path forward. I was professional, direct, and in complete control. When I finished, I turned my attention solely to Dominic. "Your position as CEO is no longer tenable," I said, my tone gentle but firm. "The board has lost confidence, and frankly, the decisions made under your leadership have put this company, and the jobs of hundreds of people, at risk." He flinched as if struck. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, but no words came out. What could he say? The numbers on the page were an irrefutable indictment. "I'm offering you a choice," I continued, leaning forward slightly. "You can resign, take a generous severance package, and walk away. Or you can stay. Not as CEO, but in a new role. Head of community projects. You would report to me, and you would start by overseeing the restoration of the Grand Majestic. You would have to learn the business from the ground up, the way I did. You would have to earn back your place." It was an olive branch, a path to redemption. It was more grace than he and his wife had ever shown me. I was offering him a chance not just to save his career, but to rebuild his character, brick by brick. He stared at me, his eyes filled with a turbulent mix of shame, anger, and a dawning, horrified respect. "Why?" he whispered. "After everything, why would you offer me that?" I thought of the years of quiet condescension, of the sting of Isabel's words, of the feeling of being invisible. But I also thought of the little boy who had once taught me how to ride a bike, of the brother who, long ago, had been my friend. "Because we're family, Dominic," I said softly. "And because I believe people can learn to be better." I did. He didn't answer. He just sat there, the weight of the choice and of his own past, pressing down on him. I let the silence hang in the air, giving him the space to make his own decision. The meeting ended. The vice presidents left, their expressions somber. Dominic remained, staring out the window at the river, a solitary figure in a world he no longer recognized. Later that week, I received a one-line email from him. "I accept." The news of the acquisition and the management change sent ripples through Port Blossom's business community. The story was irresistible, the quiet, overlooked sister saving the legacy of the Golden Boy brother. My name was suddenly everywhere. I gave one carefully controlled interview to the city's most respected financial paper, focusing not on the family drama, but on Havenwood's mission and our plans for the city's architectural heritage. Isabel did not take it well. I heard through the grapevine that she was mortified, furious, and refusing to speak to anyone. She had built her identity on being the wife of a powerful man at a prestigious firm. Now, her husband worked for his sister, the very woman she had dismissed as a lucky nobody. The foundation of her world had crumbled. One rainy afternoon, about a month after the acquisition, my assistant buzzed me. "There's an Isabel Dalton here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment." My heart gave a little lurch. I took a deep breath. "Send her in." Isabel walked into my office. It was the first time she had set foot in one of my buildings. She looked smaller than I remembered, her usual polished armor replaced by a fragile vulnerability. She wore a simple trench coat, her hair pulled back, her face devoid of makeup. She looked around the room, at the architectural plans for the Grand Majestic spread across my desk, at the photos of a smiling Milo on my credenza, at the view of the thriving Millrace Commons below. She didn't speak for a long time. Her gaze finally settled on me. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't see any of this." "I know," I said, my voice quiet. I felt no anger, only a wave of deep, complicated pity. Her world had been so small, her definition of success so narrow, that she had been blind to anything that existed outside of it. "Dominic told me. He told me what you offered him," she said, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. "A chance. After everything I said. Everything I did. Why weren't you cruel? You had every right to be." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city I was helping to rebuild. "What would that have accomplished, Isabel?" I asked, more to myself than to her. "Cruelty is easy. It's what you do when you have no other tools. Building things, restoring things, that's hard. It takes patience and vision. And it's a much better way to live." She stood there, speechless. The gulf between us was vast, but for the first time, it felt like there was a bridge, however fragile, beginning to form across it. She didn't apologize, not in words. But in her eyes, in her stunned silence, I saw a confession. I saw the shattering of a lifetime of certainty. She left as quietly as she arrived. I didn't know if our relationship would ever truly mend. I didn't know if Dominic would succeed in his new role, or if he would eventually crumble under the weight of his own humbled pride. Some things I was learning you couldn't fix. You could only give them the space to heal or to break. That evening, I went home and helped Milo with his homework. Adrian came in and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder as I pointed out a state capital on a map. "You okay?" he asked softly. I leaned back against him, the familiar comfort of his presence a welcome anchor. "I am," I said, and I was surprised by how true it was. A deep sense of peace had settled over me, quiet and steady. I hadn't set out to conquer my brother's world. I had only set out to build my own. In the end, I had learned that true power wasn't about winning or losing or proving others wrong. It was about the quiet, steadfast work of becoming yourself. It was about looking at a broken thing and seeing not its flaws, but its potential. And it was about having the strength and the grace to build it back up, better than it was before. Looking out my window, at the lights of Port Blossom twinkling in the twilight, I knew my work was far from over. I was just getting started.